In 2004, director Edgar Wright and star Simon Pegg gave the world a wonderfully quirky and dark rom-com about the end of the world.
In 2022, Kentucky Owl gives us an accessible expression.
The film is Shaun of the Dead.
The whiskey is the Wiseman Bourbon.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are starting a mini-series of films by the writer and director Edgar Wright, starting with his 2004 hit comedy, Shaun of the Dead. Brad, it feels really nice to steer out of Martin Scorsese territory and into Edgar Wright territory.
Man, I am so glad that we did Silence, because I think that movie needs more just run, and people need to hear about it more often. But Shaun of the Dead is like just a little bit different of a movie.
You know, not the least of which is that it's 90 minutes long.
Oh, dude.
Once
God
again,
bless
can we
film
please...
directors?
Yes, let's sing the praises of the short movie.
Yes, I'm there, man.
You know, like when I went to put this movie on, and I've seen it before, but I didn't remember that it was as short as it is. And I saw that with credits, it's like 97 minutes. And I'm like, man, I don't know how they're going to fit all these things I remember into an hour and a half. And I gotta say, first of all, what an efficient and economical use of the script and the runtime that this movie needed to have. But also, if they stretched this out to 2 hours, it would be too much movie. Like,
yes,
I gotta be honest, man. They hit every note perfectly when it comes to the rhythm and the pacing of this film.
I think that if I had to spoil some of my thoughts on Edgar Wright as a director, I just think the pacing of his movies is spectacular. He just has an ability to keep things flowing in the right direction of where he wants things to go. And it never feels rushed, but it always feels, I don't know, man. There's just a flow to it that I love.
I think we should start today's episode by trying to place this movie in the historical context. This movie comes out in 2004, which blows my mind because I remember this movie coming out. I remember seeing it on cable for years and years after its release. It was on Comedy Central all the time. And, you know, it's been almost 20 years now. This movie's 18 years old. And in a lot of ways, it is a relic of the mid-2000s because it's doing things that I think it was kind of like the forerunner to, but it has that like How I Met Your Mother whoosh sound effect when they're panning in between scenes. And, you know, Edgar Wright loves to do that kind of whiplash effect throughout the movie. And so it's really cool to see that this movie feels very much of the moment that it was made, but that's also because it helped make that moment. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's one of the reasons this movie ages so well is because it doesn't rely on it in the way that future projects would, like How I Met Your Mother. I think that a lot of times, sometimes there's certain like, you know, techniques and tropes that occur in cinema. And, you know, the person who starts it is known because they started it, and then other people perfect it. But other times, I think the opposite happens, where the first person to do it keeps it the most streamlined, and other people kind of add on to it, and that, like, almost, like, ruins it a little bit. Honestly, Bob, are you okay if I get, like, wildly nerdy for a second?
Oh, please do.
It reminds me of, in, like, our undergrad and grad classes, when we would talk about biblical texts and how if you had a text in order to date like when this text was found, you know, let's say they found a scrap of paper and had the book of John written on it, in order to figure out which text it was, the scholars would basically look and be like, all right, is this like really fancy Greek, or is it really short and like pared down And if it's really short and pared down, that's closer to the original text, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like you can kind of see the same thing in cinema, that people don't just do the same trope. They add on their own little flair to it. They add on their own little bit to it. And man, with Shaun of the Dead, you just have a classic of mid-2000s cinema that has zero fat on it.
Absolutely no fat on it. And it manages to act as this giant functioning metaphor again, it's such an economical movie. Like, they could have really drug out what they were trying to say. And if this was an American comedy of that time, if this was a Judd Apatow movie, this would be 2 hours and 25 minutes long, and it would be way too long. And we'd be talking about how they could have cut an hour out of it. And this is just, it's almost perfect writing. It's almost perfect directing and pacing. I cannot wait to jump into it with you, Brad. But go ahead.
Before we get to Brad Explains, you know what I just literally realized? This is the British comedic version of Fight Club.
It kind of is.
Like,
it's even the same central metaphor.
Yeah, like the entire movie is about how the average British citizen is a zombie in their life, and they need to wake up and take charge of their lives.
Oh, that's not at all what I was going for, but that's okay. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Listen, before we jump into our favorite segment, which is called Brad Explains, we want to give a quick plug for our Patreon. You can find us at patreon.com/filmwhiskey, where you can support us at 3 different tiers, $3, $5, and $7 a month. At each of our support tiers, you get a ton of bonus perks. At all of the support tiers, you get access to a special Discord server that Brad and I are on every single day, talking with members of the Film and Whiskey Patreon community. Once again, you can find us at patreon.com/filmwhiskey. And with that, it is time for Brad Explains. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. This was not your first time seeing this film, correct?
Most definitely not.
Awesome.
Bob, I think that this film was actually on my list for season 5. And like, as we kind of went over the list together, you were like, man, Shaun of the Dead's on my like long-term list as well. It's going to get on the podcast. Let's just wait for it. So this is definitely a movie that I was wildly excited for.
All right. Well, then the pressure is on, man. We've put 60 seconds on the clock. Can you break down the plot of Shaun of the Dead?
Shaun of the Dead is about a 29-year-old British citizen named Shaun, who is completely aimless in his personal life. He has a layabout, deadbeat best friend who holds him back in life, and he has a dead-end job, and the only thing going for him is his girlfriend, Liz, who breaks up with him at the start of the movie because he kind of sucks, and he's holding her back. And then zombies. And in the midst of a zombie apocalypse, he finds himself in a place of control and authority and taking charge and doing something cool with his life. Mm-hmm. And they drink at a bar called the Winchester. And I think that's important to know.
It is. All right. There's Brad Explains.
I think that's it, man.
I do love it when Brad Explains doesn't necessarily give away every twist and turn of the story. Like, there's still, at this point of the podcast, a little bit of mystery. So I guess if you haven't seen Shaun of the Dead, you still have a chance to go watch it and then come back and finish this episode. Because as we go on, we will be getting into spoiler-filled territory.
Yes.
Brad, where do you want to start today? Because if I dictate where we're going to go, I have a feeling I won't be able to avoid talking about the kind of deeper themes of the movie for very long. Because on its surface, like, this is a very surface level movie. It's a comedy, you know, it's about a not down on his luck guy, but a ne'er-do-well kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot more going on than that. So I'm almost like, please take us in a different direction so that I don't give all the goods away too quickly.
Yeah, I mean, let's start by talking about the performances, mm-hmm. and then I think it'd be worthwhile to talk about Edgar Wright. And, you know, we didn't really talk with Scorsese or Spielberg about, like, I don't know, like, tics that they have as a director.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, certain styles that they always use in their movies. And I think that's because they don't really need those.
Well, and they're both well documented in the annals of film and whiskey at this point, too.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like, we've talked about it enough at this point. Whereas, like, I think it'd be interesting to talk about Edgar Wright because he is a really interesting director. So, yeah, let's jump into performances first.
Well, why don't we jump into the directing first? I feel like you did such a good job of setting that up.
Thanks, Bob.
Let's talk about Edgar Wright. I think maybe it's fortuitous that he came on the heels of Scorsese here, because even though his kind of manic style is much more lighthearted and the way he whips between scenes is not exactly the same as Scorsese, in 2004, if you were looking for somebody to compare him to, there really were probably only a few directors who directed with that kind of manic energy. One of them would probably be the British director Danny Boyle, but the other one would be Scorsese. And it's really kind of obvious when you watch this movie, having just come off of Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and, to a lesser extent, Silence. But you can see that kind of kinetic energy carry over into A New Generation with Edgar Wright.
Yeah, the way he uses the characters and how they are always moving. Like, Simon Pegg almost never stops moving in this movie, and I love it. Like, even at the start of the film, the one moment he sits down to play video games with his, deadbeat best friend, Ed, he immediately goes, "You've got work." And he turns off the controller and gets up and goes to work.
Yep.
And, like, you have a sense that Edgar Wright is just obsessed with movement. And I think we'll see that especially in the third film we talk about, Baby Driver. Mm-hmm. But the way that they move in this movie is just beautiful. I think that the oneer that he does with Simon Pegg walking to the store and back is brilliant. It doesn't belong in like what should be an average rom-com of the mid-2000s, and yet there it is. Like, it almost feels like Children of Man, but a comedy.
Yeah.
Like,
you're right. It is really brilliant because the way they set it up and the way they pay it off. And that's something that I think we're going to keep coming back to when we get into the script. Everything has a payoff. And it doesn't have a payoff in the way that we talked about with Back to the Future, where it's like a really tacky payoff. Mm-hmm. But you see it with those two shots. On successive days, he walks to the store and you see life bustling in the background. And then the next day he walks to the store with a hangover and the zombie apocalypse has started and he doesn't even notice it. But as the viewer, you're watching this camera track in the exact same way. And it's such a great shot.
Yeah. The beautiful thing is that the way he shoots those shots back to back rewards multiple viewings of the movie, mm-hmm. right? Like, this isn't a movie that you watch once and you're like, oh, that was a great movie, I'll never watch it again. Yeah. Like, as soon as you watch it again, you start looking for the little things in the background. You look for the little callbacks to things that happened earlier in the movie. And I think Wright just does a masterful job that, in one, you see a guy like mowing his teeny tiny little lawn in the background. And in the next day, you see him lying dead on the ground.
Yeah.
And it's fast. Like, you would miss it if you blinked.
Yep.
But as he walks past, there's a dude lying dead in the background, and Simon Pegg doesn't even come close to noticing it. And it's just brilliant.
Well, I think if Edgar Wright is part Scorsese, he's also part Tarantino, because you do get a sense that his awareness of the genre and of pop culture really informs the way this movie is made. And they really play it up with the kind of the cheesy sound effects on purpose to, like, I don't want to say to diminishing returns, but, it's very mid-2000s. I'm just going to keep mm-hmm. saying that. But in the first, third of the movie, you as an audience member know that a zombie apocalypse is going to come. And again, it's important to point out that in 2004, we hadn't had this new wave of zombie movies and zombie TV, and The Walking Dead and all of its random spin-off stuff hadn't taken over culture. Shaun of the Dead really kind of brought that back in, mm-hmm. as did Zack Snyder with his Dawn of the Dead remake. And so this movie was really kind of on the forefront of bringing the zombie story back into mainstream culture. But because Edgar Wright knows that you're familiar with the tropes of a zombie movie, every time someone kind of turns around slowly or glances off camera. They do that sort of like dissonant violin chord where you think like, oh, this is going to be the big reveal of the zombie. And then it's not. And they do that fake out like 8 times. And it's really funny and stupid. But I love that they build the self-awareness into the movie like that.
Yeah. And the amount of references that they place to other, precursors in the world of zombie movies is wild. I mean, the amount of stuff they do. There's even one point I was doing research, not for the movie, but for, Canada's favorite segment, Two Facts and a Falsehood. And there's a part where he's walking into the convenience store on the zombie day, and there's a broadcast going on. The owner of the store is an Indian man. The broadcast is in Hindi, and essentially somebody translated it, and even the translation is like, people are saying prayers as dead rise from their graves. And I'm like, the wild amount of detail that they put into this movie. Once again, I think I'm just stunned that this mid-level, low-budget, mid-2000s comedy has just so much attention to detail in it.
Well, and one thing that I really love that they do, and I guess we're just getting into scripting now, we're all over the place today, and I'm cool with it, is that they never explain the origin of it, and they offer like little tidbits of what it could have been. But as Shaun is walking into that store the first time, you hear a radio report going on that an American spacecraft like re-entered orbit and crashed outside of England somewhere. And so you're like, oh, maybe that's what it is. But then they cut away to the cover of 2 different newspapers, and one of them is talking about GMO produce, and the other one is talking about some other calamitous thing. And so you never find out the origin of this whole zombie thing. And even at the end of the movie, they return to that gag because someone on TV is like, and who would have thought that the thing that caused it was, and right then Shaun turns the channel. So I love that they are aware of the kind of MacGuffin, and they don't care. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, it doesn't matter what caused it.
But they also, I'm glad you brought up the end of the film, because I think one of my favorite parts of this movie is the commentary on society. And they basically said, like, yeah, let's be really honest. If zombies came about, they wouldn't destroy us at this point. Like, we have guns, and we'd be able to stop a zombie apocalypse. And what would we do with zombies then? Somebody would not let us kill them because, human rights and stuff. So we're going to turn them into a game show.
Yeah.
Like, tell me that is not exactly what would happen, not just in 2004, but in 2022.
Oh. Like Netflix would be raking it in with all the different reality shows.
Yeah, dude. It'd be like real life Squid Game happening with zombies.
All right, well, let's finally get into talking about these performances. I want to talk about Simon Pegg, who co-wrote the movie. And this is the first in what becomes kind of an unofficial trilogy with the 2 stars of the film and Edgar Wright. And I still think this is the best of the 3. And it's primarily because the performances are so good. I'm trying to hold off on talking about what this movie's really about, but watching Simon Pegg, come of age in this movie, like grow up a little bit and experience emotion and offer forgiveness and cut people out of his life who should be cut out of his life and, make difficult decisions. It's just, Brad, a performance this good has no business being in a movie like this. And there's so much gravitas and emotion in some of these scenes. And it's only because Simon Pegg is such a good and committed actor.
Dude, can we just like zoom in on one scene really quick?
I know exactly what scene it's going to be. Go for it.
Bill freaking Nighy.
He's so good. He's so good in everything.
He's so good at everything. And they're sitting in the back of that freaking car, and he's bleeding out by the neck, and he's crammed up with Simon Pegg. And, even just the scripting decision to pick everybody up, to shove them in the car, and then use that as the moment, because the camera has to be right up in their face, because that's how they feel as characters in the moment. Like just beautiful cinematography and like scripting choices. Yep. But on top of all that, you just have Bill Nighy, who at this point might be the best dad in the history of all movies we've watched in the Film and Whiskey podcast.
He definitely wins the award for Dad Who Makes Us Cry.
Yes, easily. He's just like telling him, and Simon Pegg, Shaun, is his stepson, and he's just bearing his soul to him, like about how hard it was to be a stepdad and how he really loved him, and he saw how hard it was on Shaun that his real dad had died, and he maybe thought that he could be something of a role model for him, and literally I'm just like, and this isn't even the end of the movie, Bob. This is like 45 minutes in, and I'm like weeping. It's so good.
It's so good, man.
As like Simon Pegg is sitting there just weeping as he's like receiving validation and like healing from childhood wounding. I freaking love it, man.
So the rest of the characters in this movie kind of orbit in and out of Shaun's life. And as it should be, this is a study of Shaun and his growing up process. And so even like, ostensibly the second lead, Ed, played by Nick Frost, he's important to the movie, but I almost feel like I don't want to spend as much time talking about his performance because that's ultimately not what the movie's about. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think that Ed has a really great arc as a character because he definitely starts off as just... I mean, they write him as an orangutan.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they write him to be the jagweed, ridiculous friend who's just the worst. But by the end of the film, somehow they transform him into what Shaun sees in him, which is a loyal, loving friend. And he grows in his own way. Mm-hmm. And I think they kill it with him. And I think Frost gives a great performance, but his performance is great because of Shaun's belief in him and the way Simon Pegg interacts with him. So I'm with you, man. Like Simon Pegg rules this movie. He is to Shaun of the Dead what Tom Cruise is to Mission Impossible.
There you go. All right, Brad, before we go to break, let's kind of round out talking about the cast, and we can just give very brief thoughts. I really do think pretty much everybody in this movie is excellent. I think Kate Ashfield is great as his girlfriend, Liz. If there's a couple people I would like to call out, it's mostly because people were in this movie before they became famous, and then they became famous. And it's like, oh, it's that guy. One of them being their flatmate, Pete, played by Peter Serafinowicz, who has become a pretty popular British comedian. You've probably seen him, if you're an American, on things like Parks and Rec, and he's been in a ton of movies at this point. One person that I noticed, Brad, was the kid who worked in the store with him. I think his name is Noel, is played by Rafe Spall, who we've had in a couple movies on the podcast now. Chief among them, he played the journalist in Life of Pi a few years after this. And you see him here, and he's kind of like, a doughy teenager, and he doesn't look hardly anything like what he looks like now. So it was really cool to see these people who have made appearances elsewhere on the show when they were much younger and less famous.
Bob, you know how little I remember from Life of Pi?
Oh, you said
you said the reporter from Life of Pi, and I was like, there's a reporter in Life of Pi?
I said Life of Pi, and Brad was like, was he the tiger? Did he play Richard Parker?
Yes. Oh, man. I don't know why that movie just hasn't stuck for me.
Oh, it should,
but
too.
It hasn't.
Man.
I think Dylan Moran, who plays David, is like the perfect bad guy for the movie. Mm-hmm. Like, he kind of feels like a C-list Alan Rickman a little bit. And it's perfect. Like, it fits so well for the movie.
You know what's really funny is when he came on screen, I was like, I thought that he was Peter Serafinowicz. And I didn't realize that Peter Serafinowicz was in the movie. So I was like, oh, man, he looks kind of different here. But I couldn't think of his name because he has a hard name to remember. And I was like, what's that guy's name? I remember seeing him in Parks and Rec. And then I looked it up and I was like, Dylan Moran, who's that? And then right then, Serafinowicz comes on screen. And I was like, this is screwing with my mind. I don't like it. These guys look a lot alike and it bothers me.
I am not going to lie, Bob. I think they look literally nothing alike. Honestly, Dylan Moran looks like Colin Firth in The Bourne Identity.
That's Colin Firth in The Bourne Identity?
Isn't it Colin Firth? He plays the assassin.
No,
who tries
that's
to kill
Clive
him?
Owen, dude.
Sorry, Clive Owen. you know. He looks like Clive Owen.
No, you know who he looks
Identity.
like? He doesn't look like Serafinowicz. He looks like if you gave the guy from Pride and Prejudice a different haircut and put glasses on him. That's who he looks like.
100%.
Yeah.
I'm with you there.
What's his name? Matthew McFadden, something like that? McConaughey, that's the guy. Yeah, so as you can tell, the cast is pretty much dominated by Simon Pegg.
Yep. I will say, if I would never have known this, most Americans wouldn't. But when the group, you know how there's the other group that they run into, led by Yvonne, who seems to be like an old flame or an old friend of Shaun's.
Yep.
So every single person in there that is like the lookalike for the people in Shaun's party, they were all in British comedies together.
Oh, nice. Like Martin Freeman?
So like Martin Freeman and Liz's friend who's dating Matthew McFadden lookalike. She and Martin Freeman were in The Office together. She was Pam on The British Office.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And Simon Pegg and whoever plays Yvonne were in a show called Spaced Out, I think.
Yep.
Which is like a British TV show. They were like the leads on that together. And literally every single one of them was a British comedic pair of some sort.
So it was like the equivalent of the Anchorman, like alleyway fight.
Yes.
Got it.
Yep. Yeah, literally.
Well, that's really cool. Shout out to all of our British listeners. You guys knew that immediately, and it took us some digging to figure that out.
It sure did, Bob.
Hey, Brad, what do you say we press pause here? Because I do want to get into talking about, you know, if we can call them deeper themes, the deeper themes of this movie. But I think we need a little bit of a social lubricant here before we get there.
This is for you, patrons. Lube me up, Daddy.
There it is.
Let's get to it, Bob.
All right, today we are checking out the Wiseman Bourbon. Now, first of all, before I say anything else about this product, on the bottle, they kind of accentuate the M in Wiseman so that it makes it seem like it should be the wise man. But it's one word, so then you got to pronounce it Wiseman. So I really have no idea what I'm saying, is basically what I'm getting at, Brad. I don't know if it's the wise man or the Wiseman, but everything I've seen calls it one word, Wiseman.
I mean, I don't really care about that. Are there 3 of them?
No, there's only 2. There's a bourbon and a rye. We need a myrrh-flavored whiskey.
Frankincense, and myrrh.
Yeah, we need a myrrh-flavored one. Come on, people. So this is from Kentucky Owl, which is now owned by the Stoli Group. About 2-3 years ago, they sold Kentucky Owl for, I don't know what it is, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars. They are building it out now. They're going to basically have a gigantic tourism destination at Kentucky Owl. Friend of show, David Mandel, has come on as CEO of Kentucky Owl, and he is like leading the charge on that build out. And in the meantime, you know, Kentucky Owl is a super premium whiskey that we have never had on the show because it costs a ton of money and is hard to find. And so Kentucky Owl was like, listen, if we're going to be a tourism destination, we have to have, you know, something that's at least kind of accessible to people. And so they've put out this product called the Wiseman. So this product is a blend of different kinds of bourbon. It's a blend of 4-year, 5.5-year, and 8.5-year bourbons. It's diluted down to 90.8 proof. Fun fact, as we said, our friend David Mandel is now leading the charge at Kentucky Owl. He came from Bardstown Bourbon Company. Part of what is in this mash bill is a blend of bourbons that Kentucky Owl has contract distilled for them at Bardstown Bourbon Company. So it's got their 4-year-old wheat and high rye bourbons blended in here.
Okay.
I'm pretty excited to try this, Brad. I mean, even at only 90 proof, I think this has a really, really interesting nose. I'm going to be drinking it live. I know that you have already taken notes. So while I give it a nosing, why don't you tell us what you think of the nose?
Yeah, as I got into the nose, it really just feels like a really nice classic bourbon with like a little bit of peanut and cherry on top of that. But yeah, I got caramel, I got vanilla, there's bits of oak. And then, like I said, a little bit of peanut and cherry on top. It's not super deep The depth isn't there, so I'm going to give it a 7.5. It's intriguing.
Yeah, I'm there too. Like, if we really wanted to get granular with our scores, this is like a 7.2 on the nose. Like, it's pretty good. It's got some very classic bourbon notes, as you said. I can tell that there is a wheated bourbon in here somewhere. It has that sort of peanutty and then also kind of root beer sarsaparilla thing underneath that a little bit. There's just a hint of fruitiness on this that it kind of accentuates all that kind of dark peanut butter caramely notes. I can't put my finger on what it is. It may be like a little bit of pineapple, but there's definitely a bright, fresh, summery fruit on top of this. Again, you're right. It's pretty subtle, and there's not a ton going on here. So I'll also give it a 7.5 on the nose.
Yeah, and then I got into the taste, and Bob, I had a full 2 ounces of this, and I guess I'll say this. I used to have this recipe for, it was like a pad thai recipe that I make, and it's really, really good. But at this point, I just kind of throw whatever I want in there, and the sauce stays the same, but everything else can kind of change. And I'll always just, Haley will ask me what I made for dinner tonight, and I'll be like, oh, generic Asian dish number 17. And I always say a different number, 23, 54. Yeah. It's just whatever it is. This is generic bourbon number 17, Bob.
Yep.
Nothing really is standing out for me. In the entire experience, I tried to give it 10 minutes. I drank half of my glass. I gave it 10 minutes. I came back to it. Was like, man, am I missing something? This is going to sound bad. I don't even know if I could give any specific notes.
Yeah.
It's not bad. It's sweet and it has some flavor to it, but I don't know if it's oaky or peanut buttery or
this really doesn't present itself at all until the mid palate. The front palate is sugar water. Mm-hmm. And then at the midway point, you start to notice this has some alcohol in it and it's a little bit tingly. And then you go to swallow, and on the back of your palate is just some very basic oak characteristics and a little bit of that brown sugar. But there's really not much going on here. And it's very thin on the mouthfeel, and for a major portion of the tasting experience, it really does drink like water, and then it goes kind of bitter from the oak on the end. So, unfortunately, there's not a lot on this that is a positive drinking experience, at least from the point of view of the palate. Brad, I think I'm only going to give this 5.5 on the taste.
I'm giving it a 5 on the taste. And I'll say this, it's not bad.
No.
It's not a bad tasting whiskey, but it's just generically sweet. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't put my finger on any specific tasting notes. When I got to the finish, I got a little bit of that cherry cola finish that, probably from the wheat whiskey that's mixed in there. And it's got some nice oak notes going on that get a little bitter at the end. I'm okay with the finish. I'll give it a 7 out of 10 there. But I don't know, Bob. What would your finish score be?
I think this is one of those areas where knowing the price of this is going to affect my objective score. But I will also say it this way. If you had put this in front of me blind and asked me to taste it and then tell you what I think it costs, I would say that this costs between $20 and $24 for a bottle of this. Yep. It is very thin. It is very mild. That is not a negative thing necessarily. But then when you start to factor in how much it actually costs, which we'll get into, it starts to kind of taint your opinion of it because you start to think, well, there should be more going on here at this price point. And so when it comes to the finish, there's just not much there. You're right. There's a hint of cherry cola. There's quite a bit of oak. And there's a nice warming sensation on the way down. But that's kind of just par for the course with a wheated bourbon. And so once again, I think I'll just give it a 6 out of 10 on the finish.
Yeah, and that brings me to balance. I'm not going to knock it. It's not terrible, but I'll give it a 5 out of 10 on balance. It's not an interesting journey. And I think that's the worst thing I probably could say about it. Where are you at on balance?
I'm going to give it a 6.5 on balance. It's a well-balanced whiskey. Again, this is a fantastic $23 bottle of whiskey. The problem is that it's not a $23 bottle of whiskey. So, like, you know, the balance is not off and it's not awful, and it's a 6.5.
Yeah.
When it comes to value, that's where things get a little wonky. Brad, I have not actually looked up to see if this is sold in the state of Ohio. Did you find it in the database?
It sure is. It is $49.99.
All right, so yeah, we're talking about a $50 bottle of whiskey here. Look, I know that this is a blend of at least 4 different kinds of whiskey from what I'm seeing, and that some of it is 8.5 years old. So if this was a majority 8.5 years old, I would say, okay, I understand the $49 price tag. There's a lot of, loss to the angels at 8.5 years old, but I don't know how much of each is blended into this. And even if it was, it's been diluted down enough that there's just not a lot of character to this thing. I can't get down with a $50 price tag, Brad, and I'm only going to give this this is going to be really low, and I feel bad saying this because I like David Mandel a lot, but I'm going to give it a 3.5 on value.
Yeah, I'm being more harsh than you, Bob. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 10 on value. I mean, this is, if this was a $17 bottle of whiskey, I think it'd be like a 9 out of 10 on value. Like it's a really impressive whiskey at $17. At $24, it's like a 7.5. It's a solid value. That's about right where it should be. At double that, it's a 2 out of 10, Bob.
Yeah. Brad, I feel bad saying this, and we've tried both expressions of it now, but I would say for sure, I would not recommend picking this up. I mean, I might recommend trying it at the bar if you're kind of like new to bourbon and you're trying to find your favorite thing at a low proof point. But even then, this is going to cost you probably $10 to $12 for a pour of this at the bar. Mm-hmm. So it's not the cheapest thing that you can find at this price point, and it's also not the best thing you can find at this price point. Brad, I'm only coming out to a 29 out of 50.
Yeah, I mean, before we factored in value, I was at a 24.5 out of 50. So, if you had an 8 out of 10 on value, that'd be a decent score. It would be in the 30s. But as it is, I'm at a 26.5 out of 50, Bob.
That's bringing us out to a 55.5 out of 100, or a 27.75 out of 50. Brad, I'm not going to recommend this one.
Yeah, I'm not either, Bob, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Now, listen, I've heard fantastic things about Kentucky Owl. If someone would like to send us some samples of Kentucky Owl, I would be happy to have that on the show. But when it comes to this new expression, the Wiseman, my recommendation is to pass.
You'd be wise to spend your money elsewhere, Bob.
All right, Brad, let's get back into talking about Shaun of the Dead. What do you say?
I'm ready, man. Let's do it. All right, everybody. That was Wiseman Bourbon, a whiskey that we were a little disappointed with, and we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Now it's time, as I mentioned before, for Canada's favorite segment, 2 Facts and a Falsehood.
Brad, I'm starting to resent this segment a whole lot. I'm not doing well this season.
Bob, it's just an opportunity for sanctification.
Yeah, you're right, man. It's an opportunity for a lot of things. It's been an up and down season for me so far, to say the least.
Yeah, that's like life. You just got to learn how to roll with the punches, man. Learn how to be more like De Niro in Raging Bull. Mm. He's a great role model for you in this.
I've always thought that. All right, man, hit me with those 2 facts and a falsehood.
Fact number 1. Shaun's place of work is called Forey Electric in the movie. Ken Forey starred in Dawn of the Dead in 1978 and had a cameo in Dawn of the Dead, released in 2004.
Okay.
Fact number 2. Simon Pegg originally wrote the script by himself years before the film came out, but for a long, long time, he felt like the script wasn't good enough, and he was looking for a director. And upon seeing Edgar Wright's first film, A Fistful of Fingers, Pegg says that he immediately knew that Wright was the perfect person to collaborate with on Shaun of the Dead. They got in contact, they rewrote the script together, and became fast friends. Fact number 3. In March of 2011, this movie, Shaun of the Dead, was voted by BBC radio listeners as their second favorite movie of all time, the first of which being The Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, interesting. Once again, nicely done. These all could be very plausible facts.
Thanks, man.
I think one sounded the most like a fact, or at least a very innocuous falsehood. 2 sounds like it could be true. 3 sounds like it could be true. I have no idea what British people like. Let's just assume they like this and Marmite, you know?
Yeah.
I'm gonna say number 3 is the falsehood.
That the BBC radio one?
Yes.
Bob, you are wrong.
Oh my gosh, dude. Oh.
The falsehood was about the script, number 2.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I will say, though, Edgar Wright's first film was called A Fistful of Fingers.
So,
and I thought that you would either not know that, and if you didn't know it, I was like, Bob's going to pick this one as the falsehood, because that's the most ridiculous name for a movie.
I just kind of figured that you wouldn't just pepper that in there as the name of a movie if it wasn't a real thing.
No, it was a real thing, man.
Wow. Yeah.
His first movie in 1995 was a parody of, I'm assuming, the Fistful of Dollars trilogy.
Right.
And it was set in it was a Western set in Western England. Do you get it?
There it is. All right. Well, I am doing just horrendously at 2 facts and a falsehood this season. You finally got something to lord over me.
Yeah. On the flip side, though, I'm doing phenomenally on 2 facts and a falsehood.
All right, man. Let's steer out of that and back into talking about this movie. I think it's time for us to just talk about the fact that this movie is a really, really good metaphor for that time in life when, you know, you're in your late 20s, you are coming up on 30, you need to settle down, you got to find a way to grow up a little bit. And this movie is a really poetic kind of visual metaphor for a young man, or, you know, a man who's not so young anymore, figuring out what he needs to sacrifice to grow up and to put his eggs in the basket of a serious relationship, and the forces that are trying to tear apart that relationship, and what it takes, you know, in terms of adjusting the relationships in your life to give somebody the precedence that they deserve in your life. I really loved it, Brad. Like, is it a super deep metaphor? Is it really subtle to pick up on? Absolutely not. Like, but I think this would be a really great movie, you know, aside from the, you know, disemboweling, to show like a group of high schoolers when you're talking about writing and how you can use metaphor to tell an overarching story. Like, this is just a really brilliant and, again, economical use of that in the script.
Yeah, I don't want to get into final scores yet, but like, I'm not going to give this movie a 10 out of 10.
No.
And yet, it feels like when you just sit down and ask yourself, what is this movie trying to do? And then look at what they produced, it's like a 10 out of 10 film.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
100%.
Like, it's just this it's like the little movie that could. Like,
I totally agree.
I just think that you're right. Like, what they were aiming for with the script, which is like this really weird and yet beautiful coming of age story disguised as a rom-com set in the world where a zombie apocalypse is happening. Like, I can't get over the fact, and I've said it a billion times, this movie shouldn't work. It just shouldn't be a great film. And yet, every time I watch this movie, I walk away just going, my God, like, they pulled off so much in this movie, so much emotion, so much humor, so much depth of character development. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but say that, like, Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright wrote one of the best comedy scripts I've ever seen.
Yeah. And I feel weird calling it a metaphor, too, because it's not really that metaphorical. It's just that they took the framing device of a zombie apocalypse. And so, like, things that in real life would be kind of either unspoken or more subtly spoken have to be more explicitly spoken because people think they're going to die at any moment. So they just say their inner feelings out loud. Mm-hmm. And because you totally buy into the zombie aspect of it, it doesn't seem forced. It doesn't seem manipulative. It doesn't seem gimmicky. Like that kind of confession scene in the back of the car with Bill Nighy is so beautifully done. And it's the same thing like when Shaun's mom dies.
Ugh.
And I hate to talk about like Shaun shooting his own mom in the head as like a beautiful metaphor, but you kind of come to understand, even though Shaun never says it, that part of the reason he's never introduced his girlfriend to his mom is that, I mean, he's a huge mama's boy, and he's never really let go of that fact. And he has, beef with his stepdad. And so he doesn't want to introduce her into that relationship and into that dynamic where his mom is probably a little too clingy and probably a little too overbearing. And again, like, if this movie is about Shaun learning to be the boyfriend that he's supposed to be, then part of that process, and, anyone who has been in a long-term relationship and had to deal with in-laws can attest. Part of that problem is finding ways to adjust some of those relationships in your life, like a parent and child relationship, so that you can prioritize somebody else above them. And as weird as it sounds to say, like, Shaun's mom ends up becoming a zombie, and therefore, like, by the way the metaphor is working, like, she becomes one of them, as in, like, a force that is trying to pull them apart, and so he has to rid himself of that. It actually, like, it doesn't sound as gimmicky as I'm making it sound. It plays really sincerely.
And I think that it really is the strength of the acting performances. Like, even just talking about Barbara, his mom, played by Penelope Wilton, which if you have watched any Downton Abbey, you will know her. Her performance is so good.
Yeah.
Like, she plays this scatterbrained mom who is like a little too clingy with her son and trying to get him to get along with her new husband. And you can tell that they've just been stuck in this pattern for decades. And yet by the end of the film, you see how she has a much deeper grasp on what's going on than you gave her credit for at the start.
Yep.
And the second part of this movie where I almost cried is when she hands Liz, his girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, girlfriend again, when his mom hands her this necklace that was given to her by his real dad.
Yeah.
And like passes on the significance of like his childhood wounding to her.
Listen, it's a really beautiful, and again, I don't want to call it simplistic, but it's a simplistic metaphor, but if it works, it works. Like, you can't fault it for that. And it kind of all comes to a head at the end of the movie where he finally has to choose Liz over Ed. And the way the movie makes it happen is that Ed has gotten a bite taken out of his neck by the zombies. And so again, if the zombies are a metaphor, then like Ed is partially holding them back. And the script forces Ed to confront this fact to Shaun and tell him, I have been holding you back in life. Like, I am kind of a loser. I have been keeping you from your potential. And if we're being honest, you would be better off leaving me behind and starting a life with Liz. And man, it's such a great representation of how you have to reframe relationships as you get into adulthood. It reminded me a lot of a movie that I've been wanting to do on the podcast that we haven't done yet from the late 90s. It's a movie called Swingers. And the lesson of that movie is pretty much exactly the same as the lesson of this movie. That, like, especially as men, A, you have to grow up a little bit, but B, that means you have to reconfigure some of these very immature and childish friendships that you have in your young adulthood. And the success of this movie is that they do all that by framing it inside of the zombie apocalypse package, but that the zombie apocalypse package doesn't only function on the level of metaphor. Like, it is also a very well done zombie movie, and there is real suspense at parts of it. And I think that's the real success of this movie, because I've seen way too many horror movies in the last few years that only work on the level of metaphor and they don't work on the surface. And this one does both.
Yeah. And on top of all that, we kind of mentioned like some of the Edgar Wright tropes earlier, but like his trademark use of music in this movie and the way music is rhythmic to what happens on screen is just freaking hilarious. And it's such a beautiful touch. And then, you have the fast cuts between slamming the phone down and making toast and scraping it on. And then suddenly it all comes to a stop and you have him eating the toast, talking to his roommate who wants to kick Ed out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, man, I'm so happy that we chose Edgar Wright for this season. like doing Spielberg was great. Scorsese is just to me, he is an enigmatic director. I never know if I'm going to like his movies or hate his movies, but I know I will always respect them. And now we're at Edgar Wright, where I'm just like, he's just a blast to watch.
Yeah, 100%. All right, man, let's move into final scores. And we've both said that this movie isn't perfect. And I do think that, there's obviously some jokes and some character traits that have aged very badly in 2022. I also think that if there is some pacing issues to the movie, they happen in the early going. Like the zombie stuff doesn't really kick in until about the 35 minute mark, which is totally fine, but it's definitely more deliberately paced. And in the early going, where it is deliberately paced, some of the writing for the characters really shows itself as being kind of thin. Like everyone who's not Shaun is just an archetype. And the way they talk to each other and interact, that's really apparent. And when you don't have the zombie stuff to distract you from those like flaws in the writing, it definitely dings the movie a little bit for me. I still think this is a phenomenal movie. Part of me wants to give it a 9.5, but that first half hour really did have some pretty big bumps in the road. Once the plot kicks in earnest, it's like, all right, we're going now, and you're strapped in, and there's nothing you can do about it. But I think ultimately, I'm going to say that this movie is a 9 out of 10.
Bob, I think I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. I sat down, and for an hour and a half, I was utterly enthralled in what Peg and Wright were giving us. And there's not a lot of movies that do that, especially in the comedy realm.
Mm-hmm.
Like, comedies often just can't engross your heart and soul as much as they do just make you laugh.
Yeah.
I don't watch Step Brothers and feel the way I do when I'm watching Bill Nighy die in Shaun of the Dead. So I think this is one of my favorite comedies of all time. And I'm going to give it easily a 9.5 out of 10.
All right, that takes us to a 9.25 out of 10. But we'd like to know what you think. Write in and tell us your thoughts on Shaun of the Dead. You can find us on our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @FilmWhiskey.
Or you can join our Discord. We are on there every single day talking to you guys, the people who listen to the Film and Whiskey podcast. So jump on there. You can find a link to our Discord at the end of every one of our show notes.
Next week, we're going to keep it rolling with more Edgar Wright. And we're going to check out a movie, Brad, that I have never seen all the way through before. This is a very rare occurrence on the Film and Whiskey podcast, but we're watching Scott Pilgrim versus the World. So join us next week for that one. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.